The implication of saying that evil is always an indication that some good is being obtained is to say that these are things worth celebrating. Any time that one of these things happens, any time that a tragedy, and of course you can see it as an emotional tragedy, a Christian is still perfectly entitled to say that they're upset by this, that they're sad, that they're angry, that they don't understand the reasons, but ultimately philosophically they have to say this is a cause for celebration. Thank goodness that this has been allowed to happen so that we can draw out some good.
I'm here again to debunk atheist YouTuber Cosmic Skeptic. Since my last response to one of his videos did so well, I thought I'd address this segment of his conversation with Bishop Barron, where Alex argues that a Christian should be forced to celebrate evil and suffering if it is ultimately an act of God's will. I actually think Alex's argument is a strong one too, far stronger than Bishop Barron gave it credit for in the conversation. Alex's argument essentially addresses the typical defences Christians give to the problem of evil. The atheist challenges the theist by asking why evil and suffering exist if God is wholly good. To which the theist will typically reply, evil and suffering exist so that greater goods can arise from them, whether that be free will, deeper understanding, or just the strengthening of one's own character. But this poses a problem. If the existence of evil and suffering is really part of God's plan to bring about better things in the future, what reason do we have not to celebrate their existence? Since evil and suffering are really indications that a higher good is being obtained, the ultimate good, then how can we respond with anything but a celebration of their existence? Alex importantly makes a distinction between cases of suffering caused by natural events and ones caused by free will, since some may say that God must allow beings to deviate from the divine will so that true freedom can exist, but we are still left with the conflict between condemning evil and recognizing it as part of God's plan. The first point to note in addressing this claim that Alex makes is that Alex takes a fairly deterministic stance on the tragedy of life. It seems that Alex's argument makes the implicit claim that we should have reverence for suffering because God intended it to come into existence. But this opposes at the very least the Christian belief that original sin caused man to be ejected out of paradise. It was therefore not necessarily God's intention for mankind to suffer, but rather it may have been the case that we had to suffer as a result of our free will in order for cosmic justice to be restored. And other similar explanations could be hypothesized. But I don't want to make an explicitly Christian defense on this subject, since I think there are points to be made from a more general viewpoint anyways, and a lot of Christians won't even believe in this notion of original sin in the explicit sense anymore. Before moving on to my other points, I'd also point out that some of the examples Alex gives of natural suffering that we may consider celebrating, such as the coronavirus, are not the best examples to use, since it's unclear how avoidable they were had mankind acted in a perfect manner beforehand. That being said, let's get on to my further points. What we have to recognise is that even if the theist believes evil exists for a purpose, the general belief is that it's still to be eradicated and overcome, that good will triumph over it. The benefit of suffering is always derived afterwards when good is strengthened as a result. Assuming we have free will then, in a coherent theistic viewpoint, we recognise that our actions and also our reactions have a certain moral weight. What is the appropriate way to respond to the existence of evil and suffering in the world? The case for celebrating evil is stronger than it might appear. As moral agents, is it not our duty to celebrate and revere that which is there to create good? Perhaps, but we also need to play our moral role in eradicating it from the world. For the theist defending the existence of suffering, suffering is always the means to an end. In the theistic worldview we have free will, meaning we can act in moral or immoral ways, and eradicate suffering successfully or unsuccessfully. The alternative view put forward by religious believers is that we should take responsibility for suffering and strive to fix the world, and I'll explain why this is different than merely a celebration. For a start, the moral weight of tragedy is placed on the shoulders of the individual. Perhaps they are not everything they could be, and if only they could become more than they are, then they could bring people closer to God's glory. Perhaps the individual could become strong enough to redeem the suffering of the world, but until that moment comes, the individual cannot celebrate, but must change instead using their free will. The individual can recognize that the world is in a fallen or imperfect state, and that celebration is only appropriate for triumph since it's uncertain. We have to realize that as moral agents with free will, we have the ability to further God's glory or to stagnate its progress. And until we act, God's glory essentially hangs somewhat in the balance. Look at my latest video about God's seeming imperfections for more on this. So what does this mean? Well, one could see a celebration of suffering as the act of delaying the triumph of good over evil, of being lethargic about its eradication and failing to adopt the responsibility to change it. It may be the case that instances of evil and suffering are some means to some higher good, but why is the good to be drawn precisely from celebrating it, rather than hating it or shunning it continually? So long as good can be found in this condemnation of suffering, which of course it can be, then there's sufficient reason not to celebrate it, at least not all the time anyways. In fact, pushing this a little further, Alex's argument becomes a bit more absurd and almost contradictory. We can view celebration as an adherence to the natural order of things, the acceptance of things of how they are, and the desire for them not to change whatsoever. And we can view condemnation as an act of moving away from the natural order of things and seeking change. Were we merely to celebrate all things exactly as they were, this would equate to somewhat of an acceptance of all of the natural order. As a result, we would stagnate and divorce ourselves from our role as moral agents. Now, while it's logically possible that this is the case, it's certainly not what any Christians believe when they discuss the problem of evil. And in fact, it's easily argued that higher goods obtain from the individualism of humans, so that they may play a role in creation. In fact, the very beauty and the very goodness of free will is the fact that we can resist and move against the natural order freely and with choice, that we can seek better paths and ways out through the world and become, in a sense, risen above nature and the natural order. And therefore, we are, in a sense, wrestling with God, but this is implicit in the Christian message that this is something good and that's something that we should do as humans. Even though it seems odd to wrestle with God, God being omnipotent, all-knowing and all good, it's actually part of carrying out the divine will that humans do that. Also absent from Alex's argument is the idea of redemption. Perhaps tragedy can be redeemed through the free will of mankind. Man stands in an existential position where he may act in a way that justifies the suffering in the world, but there is no reason to assume that accomplishment is certain. This way, suffering should not be celebrated but looked upon gravely. It gives with one hand and takes with the other, and perhaps the odds are stacked highly against mankind. Maybe all suffering can be redeemed, but redeemed at the price of man's dread at the additional weight on his shoulders, and the uncertainty of his task until its moment of completion. No reason to celebrate until the deed is completed. We can expect, in fact, an all-good God to create a world where triumph is uncertain, so long as it means that a successful triumph would be of higher value. In a way, you can see Jesus' triumph on the cross in his crucifixion was uncertain until the moment of its completion as well. I think there's good evidence for this in the Bible, when the Bible talks of Jesus' temptation, implying that he could have used his free will to have never completed the deed and absolved mankind from their sins. And also when he says, "It is accomplished," only on the moment of the cross and never before. Another way of looking at this is to analyse what would happen if we celebrated all tragedy in the way Alex supposes. One can make a strong case that this would only distance ourselves from our moral role and encourage the growth of further tragedy and suffering, under the maxim, "The result of our lack of action is God's great plan," which sounds fairly twisted from the start, but also fails to recognise that one likely option God has to redeem creation, if suffering continues, is to deliver justice to those who fail to eradicate it. Therefore, the only course of justice may be to wipe out mankind as punishment, all for a net result that only has to maintain God's goodness prior to creating man, not even increase it. Hardly a reason for any person to celebrate. Here we can see why the idea of responsibility is so important. Even if it seems ludicrous to take responsibility for all the world's suffering, it's at the very least the opposite of hubristic. And the Israelites adopt this maxim throughout the Old Testament. All of this being said, and I hope it was at least somewhat useful and thought-provoking, the question is still left to ask. Should we celebrate the existence of any suffering and evil? To which I would answer, should we celebrate our own existence? We all know we are flawed creatures that commit small atrocities wherever we go, and we often place very high standards on God's creation. We ask why suffering would exist, why evil and imperfection would exist, but forget our gratitude that we exist, with all of our flaws. Despite not being perfect, perhaps we can find enough self-respect to believe it's good that we exist, even in the eyes of God himself. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and at the very least my aim was to be thought-provoking, whether you agreed with me or not. I'd love it if you could leave a thought-provoking comment of your own down below. Some personal news from me. Next week I'm starting a degree in philosophy and theology at the University of Oxford. The subject is a big passion of mine, of course, and I'm massively excited and grateful to have the opportunity to study there. And if I come across anything particularly interesting in the course, of course I will share it with you guys here too. Thank you guys all for watching and taking the time to hear my thoughts. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. I'll see you then.